Thank you, sir. Just to move on to the discussion now on how air and space power work with the other domains in the joint environment, I'd like to pass to Mr. Michael Shoebridge to moderate our eminent panel discussion. Mr. Shoebridge is well known to our Australian audience and many more beyond as the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, our key defence think tank, and as an important public commentator on defence. Michael joined ASPI from the Department of Defence, where he worked across policy and capability, and an area of particular relevance to our discussion today, contestability. I'd also like to welcome our panel members now, please. Vice Admiral Mike Noonan, Chief of Navy, Lieutenant General Rick Burr, Chief of Army, and Rear Admiral Ian Murray, Acting Chief of Joint Capabilities. And I'll hand over to Michael Shoebridge. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gretchen. And it's lovely to see people in a live audience. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you and also to moderate this panel. I'll keep my remarks right now short and really just get into the facilitation after each of the chiefs has given you their view. So we'll do it in service precedence order. We'll have Chief of Navy, then Chief of Army, and then the Chief of Joint Capabilities, then questions and discussion from the floor and online. So first, please, Vice Admiral Mike Noonan, Chief of Navy.
Thanks very much, Michael, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To my great friend and colleague, Mel Hupfield, Chief of Air Force, thanks very much, Mel, for the opportunity to be here today, and I congratulate you on the real and virtual audience that you've got here for this great Sea and Air Power Conference, Sea and Air and Space Conference. I've got to get the senior service in there. I'd like to first of all acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands that we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have served in our Defence Force in times of peace and war. I'd like to pick up with my brief remarks today where the Chief of Air Force left off on the notion of curiosity, because it's only through encouraging professional curiosity that we take calculated risks and that ultimately that we will succeed as a joint force. I'm reminded of the excellent series of books called Military Effectiveness by Alan Millett and Williamson Murray. And in the first volume, Paul Kennedy, and I'm paraphrasing here, concludes his chapter by saying that rare kind of imagination that allows us to plan for not only the current state of our profession, but for its future development also. Yet without that imagination, that professional curiosity, we are unlikely to be effective in the first place. So from the outset, I'd like to recognise and acknowledge the great contribution that the air and space power manuals are making to encouraging and enabling curiosity and, of course, imagination. As Mel announced, the Air Power Manual in its 7th edition has come a long way since its very first edition, and this is indicative of the growing maturity of thinking around and about the importance of air power in the Australian Defence Force. I note and commend the use of language, air power practitioners who are found not only in the three services, but throughout the public service and, of course, in the defence industry. This is a really good way of encouraging and of making more easily and accessible the relevant information that is so important to all of us. The same logic, of course, applies to the development of the Space Power E-Manual, and it's in a very good starting place. So how do these manuals contribute to the Joint Force? And at the most fundamental level, by making them relevant to all of us. That is the way in which all air power practitioners will consume, digest, and ultimately make this information their own as they apply it in our own domains. And it would be remiss of me as the senior service not to point out, of course, that the first naval aviation flight from one of our ships occurred 105 years ago from HMAS Sydney 1 when she launched the very first aircraft from a warship on the 8th of December 1917. So what do these manuals mean for the integrated force capabilities? And to have an integrated force, you firstly need to understand the elements, the components, if you will, that you are integrating. And certainly the creation and exercise of power in all 5 domains is a substantial undertaking. If I focus just on sea power for a moment, just getting a ship to sea safely, reliably and predictably is a very significant undertaking. One which stretches beyond just the people in our uniforms and the partners in government and industry. We rely on education, we rely on academia, and we rely on the skills of others to support us at sea. And of course, this can be said in all 5 domains. And it's only once that you have a level of understanding of a domain that you can start to consider how it interacts and relies upon those other domains. So how integration is best achieved, what is necessary and what is sufficient. I guess you can start to understand all these things that you can do and distinguish them against what we should do. So these 2 manuals, which have been launched by the Chief of Air Force today, I believe that they will be essential reading for all of us, because the knowledge that they impart and the thinking that they invoke will be necessary for all of us to operate in an integrated force. And that's essentially what we are and what we will continue to aspire to. So in this, I note the effort that was put into encouraging air and space power practitioners across defence in the development of these manuals. And while it is perhaps natural that they are produced by Air Force, it is equally natural that they are used to inform all of us. So I'd like to take this opportunity to again to congratulate Mel and everybody that's contributed to the writing and distribution of the air and space manuals. And I have had a read of this one. I am yet to log on to the space manual, but I'll be sure to do so. Thanks, Mel, and congratulations.
Great. So we'll now get the Army perspective on this integrated approach and what it means to the Army and reactions to what the Chief of Air Force has said. So Lieutenant General Rick Burr.
Hey, thanks, Michael, and thank you for the opportunity to join the panel today. And I'll congratulate the Chief of Air Force on the launch of the Space Power Manual and the updated Air Power Manual today. It's great to be with you all, and I welcome everyone that's here in person and virtually, and in particular those from overseas. It's great to be back together again. And I'll also take this opportunity again to acknowledge Air Force's 100 years, a celebration year last year that was disrupted, but this serves as, I think, one of those opportunities to all come together and celebrate and recognise what has been a tremendous first century. And these manuals are indicative of the thinking about how we embrace the next 100 years. It's recognition that, like land power, air and space power are not the domains of any single service. Air and space power are important to us all. And this is reinforced by the fact that we're all here as the professional heads of our service, but also as the domain leads. In Army, we talk about being ready now, but also future ready. And air and space power is where we've invested a lot of our thinking, in lockstep with Chief of Air Force as a domain lead, to ensure we're prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. The interplay of technology, geopolitics and economics is accelerating change in the character of war. As Chief of Army, I'm focused on ensuring Army, in support of the Joint Force, is prepared for the challenges and uncertainties of the future. Advances in space power, as an example, are enabling new technologies and tactics in the land domain. The democratisation of space is creating new and unique threats to land forces. To compete and win in what we are calling accelerated warfare, land forces must orchestrate effects across all domains and integrate with like-minded partners and allies. The more cohesive, integrated and networked our force is, the more effective we will be in achieving our strategic objectives of shape, deter and respond. The need for interconnectedness competes with the need for greater dispersion and survivability. Unifying our domains allows the land force to be connected and dispersed at the same time. Now, and increasingly so in the future, Army's teams will need to contribute more to air and space power and access other joint capabilities at ever lower echelons. Our Army in Motion concepts and the Army Objective Force design focuses on these challenges. Air and land have always worked together to achieve military objectives. Since the early days of the Army Flying Corps in 1911, Army has been providing aviation reconnaissance, firepower support, air mobility, battlefield support and surveillance for ground forces. From this experience, Army's contribution to air power has continued to evolve as it always has, preparing for the demands of accelerated warfare. New capabilities approved or under consideration by government allows our Army to better contribute military power that enables the Australian Defence Force to shape, deter and respond on behalf of the nation. To deliver some of these capabilities and be set for the demands of continuous competition or conflict, we are proactively redesigning our organisations and command and control arrangements. In December of last year, we established Army Aviation Command as part of this important work, and I acknowledge General Steve Jobson up in the audience. Army Aviation Command has been organised to strengthen command, leadership and management of increasingly complex systems and in turn strengthen airworthiness and air-mindedness in Army and help be better organised for multi-domain operations. It will coordinate the introduction into service of new helicopters and unmanned aerial systems and enhance the effectiveness, sustainability and safety of our current systems. This is important, for example, as we replace the ARH Tiger with the AH-64 Echo Apache, with its much more capable weapon systems and sensors and enabling integration and teaming with unmanned aerial systems. Already a prolific user of unmanned aerial systems, this area will only increase in scale and complexity, including the potential for armed capabilities in due course. I expect we will deepen cooperation with the Air Force's Air Warfare Centre to further develop concepts and tactics. And similarly, in air and missile defence, we are introducing as we speak the Enhanced National Advanced Surface to Air Missile, NASAMS, to the ADF, which will ultimately nest within the broader Air 6500 air defence project. Within the future investment in long-range fires and land-based maritime strike capabilities, Army is considering raising a fires formation to centralise, optimise and integrate our integrated air and missile defence and strike capabilities being introduced into service. All of these capabilities not only support the land force but also support sea, air and space power, extending reach, capacity, persistence and presence for the joint force. Army's contribution to space power is also not new, but the Space Power Manual today is extremely timely as we all absolutely focus on that in a more unified way. Technological advances in both the military and commercial sectors are accelerating and are increasing the number of actors who use space. As the ADF continues to conceptualise and implement its diverse space workforce requirements, expertise will be drawn from Army's existing work groups that are specialised in electro-optic imagery analysis, radar surveillance, ballistics and electromagnetic spectrum operations. Many of these specialists reside with Army's 6th Brigade, which is responsible for generating Army's air defence, formation ISR and electronic warfare force elements. These skills are readily employable in the space domain now. In Army, our SATCOM professionals are pioneering how Army maintains the assured access to a contested space domain. These efforts have been bolstered through our long-standing engagement with the US SATCOM Support Centre Pacific, where we provide officers and soldiers in support of satellite planning and operations. In addition, Army personnel are now embedded in US Space Force. We are building the expertise to introduce Defence Project 9358 Phase 1, Space Electronic Warfare. This is the ADF's project to acquire the first deployable ground-based space EW capability for the ADF, denying and degrading the electronic systems of an adversary. It will deliver the material, facilities and workforce growth to raise a new tri-service subunit called 74 Electronic Warfare Squadron within the 7th Signals Regiment up in Queensland. Space provides the high ground advantage to land forces. Space power enables land forces to be connected and dispersed at the same time through access to space-based systems for global positioning, navigating and timing, satellite communications, targeting intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, mapping and weather forecasting. The generation of space power will require more, though, than just the employment of space systems. It will demand a coherent, joint and integrated culture in the space domain. Increasing the awareness of space power within Army will be a critical part of this cultural development. Indeed, last year, as the Chief of Army Symposium in Brisbane, Mr. Enrico Palermo, the head of the Australian Space Agency, joined us to discuss that journey that we must all go on. We must understand how each of the constituent parts of military power are enabled by the other. This prepares our people for roles across the ADF and expands our thinking and will ultimately contribute to success in multi-domain operations. And I'll just finish on people, of course. And Army's workforce will continue to contribute to the development of air and space power, both as technical experts and as joint warfighters. This Friday, I will promote to Brigadier Chris Gardner, who will be the ADF's first Director General of Space Operations within Space Command. Our people are the strength of everything that we do. It is our people who make stronger and more capable teams and build strong partnerships between the services, other nations and with industry. Army is focused on the future workforce challenges as we seek to leverage more talent and people in our community to realise some of the ADF's nascent capabilities. They're already out there. Just last Friday I was up at Lismore visiting our tri-service people supporting the floods and I came across a young Army Reserve signaller. I asked him what he did when he wasn't doing his Army time. He was a spacecraft engineer. He's also a signaller in the Army. We must harness these specialist skills, and I think we're all absolutely determined to do so. Our doctrine, training and education remain pivotal to maintaining our professional mastery and intellectual edge. And the launch of these two manuals are very welcome initiatives that provide the framework necessary for our people in any service to embrace and enhance air and space power in support of unified domain operations. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. Look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. Now the last before we get into the actual discussion is the Chief of Joint Capabilities, Rear Admiral Ian Murray.
Thanks very much, Michael. Good afternoon to all of you here and joining us virtually online at the conference today. First of all, I'd just quite to just quickly reflect on Kath's opening remarks about always going last and offer a slight correction, as there is another chief these days, and the Chief of Joint Capabilities appropriately goes last in terms of rank and precedence often in the meetings that we attend together, but perhaps not always last in terms of the military effects that we call upon as we shape, deter and respond. I'd like to start by congratulating Air Force on today's release of two excellent publications, the 7th edition of the Air Power Manual and the 1st edition of the Space Power Manual. Much has changed since the 1st edition of the Air Power Manual was published 32 years ago in 1990. The changes made in this 7th edition and the content of the new Space Power Manual clearly demonstrate Air Force's focus and commitment to the One Defence approach. Evident in both manuals is the clear understanding that achieving integration across the 5 war-fighting domains is essential to generating a joint force capable of effectively contributing to national power. I'll take this opportunity to briefly highlight some of Joint Capability Group's contributions to air power and space power and to raise some considerations on how the ADF might seek to generate and deliver joint effects in the future. As the foundation of the Joint Force, my group's capabilities enable and are embedded in the generation and application of air power and space power. Joint Capabilities Group's mission is to prepare warfighting and support capabilities for the Joint Force in peace and war. Joint Capability Group and its spectrum of joint enabling capabilities are unique in defence and are an exemplar of the One Defence approach. As Acting Chief of Joint Capabilities, I'm responsible as Defence's lead for the cyber domain. Since the establishment of Joint Capabilities Group, which includes Information Warfare Division, just under 5 years ago, significant progress has been made to enhance defence cyber capabilities. During this relatively short period, it has become increasingly apparent that emerging capabilities managed in the cyber and space domains have changed the strategic environment in ways that have made the boundaries between warfighting domains less clear and more tightly interwoven. The ubiquity of the space and cyber environments are now truly global in nature. This creates opportunity for effects in these domains to be applied without the geographic considerations that have traditionally been so central to actions in the maritime, land and air domains. While all warfighting domains are closely interconnected with the cyber domain, the realisation of capabilities in the air and space domains is particularly reliant on effective air cyber integration and space cyber integration. Through Information Warfare Division, JCG, or Joint Capabilities Group, leads Defence's cyber domain, comprising three principal parts: cyberspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, and the information environment. The cyber domain is joint by nature, and Joint Capabilities Group delivers three key programs in the cyber domain that are central to the delivery of air power. They are the Joint Cyber Program, the Joint Command, Control, Communications and Computers Program, or Joint C4 Program, and the Joint Electronic Warfare Program. The capabilities delivered by Joint Capabilities Group in the cyber domain both enable operations in the physical domains and are also reliant on physical operations and assets. Air domain, space domain and cyber domain capabilities must continue to be developed and employed in close cooperation. Realising integration between the domains is essential for our future operational success as a joint force and with our coalition partners. And as air power practitioners, you'll know that dependency is the first operational consideration for the employment of air power. Joint Logistics Command, as one of the commands in Joint Capabilities Group, is an integral enabler to air power systems. Through the National Support Base, it maintains supply chains to enable the sustainment of air bases and specialised naval assets from which aircraft operate, and facilitates provision of aviation fuel, explosive ordnance payload replenishment, the delivery and maintenance of spares, the maintenance of ground support equipment, and the coordination of joint movements. Within another command within Joint Capabilities Group, the Australian Defence College, it works closely with the three services to deliver the Australian Joint Professional Education Continuum. The increasing connectedness of our joint professional education and domain-specific education is clear, and the two manuals released today demonstrate the importance of this. Air Power Mastery and Space Power Mastery, encapsulated in the concepts of air-mindedness and space-mindedness, are nested in the joint concepts of professional mastery. Together, our joint and domain education continuums prepare personnel with the domain expertise and the joint understanding required to build the joint force. Our education and training systems recognise that while embracing technology is important, warfare is essentially a human endeavour. It seeks to foster the human-technology relationship required to unlock the potential of capabilities. an important dimension of our future-proofed joint professional education system is recognising when and how to offload lower-order cognitive activities to automation through human-machine learning, while simultaneously exploiting augmented cognition for the most challenging of problems. I would like to highlight the work of Joint Capabilities Group's Sovereign Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise, which is improving Australia's stock surety and supply chain and developing Australia's guided weapons and explosive ordnance industrial base. The enterprise's work highlights the interconnected nature of all elements of national power, including economic and industry, to generate and sustain the joint force. The success of the GUIO enterprise is inextricably linked to the successful application of air power during the conduct of war. Throughout my career, I've observed the evolution of the joint approach to warfighting. With the continuous changes in Australia's strategic environment, we are increasingly recognising the need for a joint approach to raise our effectiveness and deepen our interoperability. Chief of Air Force just commented in his address to launch the two manuals that every environment in which the ADF operates is comprised of all 5 domains. The boundary between the domains are useful for Defence to manage the practicalities of resource apportionment and accountability. They are, however, self-defined and provide us with an opportunity to consider how Defence can most effectively and efficiently structure and generate capabilities that build the future ADF joint force. Over the next 2 decades, Defence will grow by 18,500 people. Much of this growth will be focused on enhancing joint capabilities. As we develop this larger, more joint force, the evolving strategic environment will make the practical divisions between the 5 domains increasingly porous. We must consider which capabilities are best generated by the service as domain leads, and which might be better delivered in a consolidated or collaborative model as joint capabilities, or indeed even delivered by industry partners. These conversations will challenge traditional structures and ownership models. However, even with future growth, the ADF will remain a relatively modest force, asked to deliver significant capability. Siloing limited capabilities within domains will not always deliver efficient or sufficiently connected capability to the future force. Growing a larger ADF with more joint force elements will require trust between groups and services. As we have embraced a one Defence approach in recent years, I have seen the trust in our joint capabilities continue to grow. To conclude, I'd like to thank each of you who are participating here today in the Air and Space Power Conference. The broad participation from across Defence and by our partners is a great reflection of our one Defence approach. Our future successes as a joint force will be underwritten by our collective commitment to develop and nurture the joint approach. Thanks for your attention.
Great. Well, thanks to each of you for giving a kind of joint but separate perspective. We've got a couple of questions already coming out from the audience, but I suppose to me, listening to all of you and each of you, I think there's a very encouraging, clear, common message about the value in the increased multi-domain approach and understanding, and how that's enabled by the work that Air Force has done with the Air and Space Power manuals, and a very clear theme about the rising importance of space. But I just want to pull on an idea that's in these manuals, and we heard from the Chief of Air Force about this big shift, I think, from individual service and mission approaches to air and space power being a contribution to the integrated force. And really, to channel back from some time ago, US Secretary of Defence Bob Gates, he said at the time that when he was the Secretary, if he got his choice, he'd give some of the US Department of Defence's resources, people and money, to the State Department because he saw the priority there. Well, the ADF is growing, as we just heard from the Chief of Joint Capabilities, by 18,500 people. So I'd be interested in hearing from each of you in this pursuit of integrated power, how each of you might think like Bob Gates where outside your own domains and capabilities would get your vote for a greater share of these growing defence resources in pursuit of that integrated force. We might just run straight down from Mel down the table. If that
I'll
makes
have
sense.
a crack at that to start with. Look, I'd probably open it by saying, and I did mention in here the concept of Navy, Army, Air Forces, the way we have to integrate and operate it will be different. One thing I do want to emphasise is that I do think that the individual services here are still vital to what we need to do to achieve the outcomes for the Joint Force. We are thinking about that, as you've just heard from each of us, all four of us, from a domain lead perspective. But as service chiefs then, because we always end up falling back into the service discussion, people are asking when we're going to start the Space Force. But from a service perspective, we bring very deliberate capabilities forward. We have the way we are, for Air Force, air-minded, we deliver air capability. And I know we're not the only deliverer of air power. My Navy and Army colleagues here have air power in their own right. But I'd certainly want to think that we would want to be able to lead in terms of the nature of air power and how we do it. But I'm not the specialist on helicopter lift and even UAS systems in some cases. So that's where we do have to work together and to be able to integrate. And what I would suggest here is that we each bring our strengths into the Joint Force, and it's that diversity that then strengthens what we're able to do. We are all required to provide capabilities into the Chief of Joint Capabilities, and he actually builds and strengthens and makes our people better and stronger and faster. And it's through those mechanisms that we then can bring those strengths into the Joint Force. To answer your question, and I think I asked this myself this morning, I asked the question whether we should have a balanced force or not. That's kind of how we've done it in the past. But I can guarantee all four of us here sit in our investment committee, and we have very, very strong debates on prioritisation for investment. And they're difficult conversations, and so they should be. These are critical thoughts that we have to really pull together. And that's the sort of question we have to answer. And I think where we're looking at the moment is we are looking for a joint force that can take transient advantage. I think the Air Commander Australia pointed out that we want to put a milestone that's far enough ahead that we can actually look to achieve and have a meaningful target to aim at. Without a target that's so far out, we end up with a force that's then not relevant when we get there. So at the moment, I think we've got some significant investment going forward, and the priority should be there. That's a very deliberate muscle move on nuclear-powered submarines, for example. The Air Force has made largely decisions that we've done in the past around our major capabilities. That's pretty stable now. So my focus of investment starts to shift to the space domain. And then within those areas, there will be key capabilities within the land domain that we need for persistence. And that's one of the attributes of air power that's not one of our strongest ones. We've got speed and we've got reach, but we sort of can't stay there all that long. So we need the means to be able to achieve that. So there's sort of three key areas that I'd have a look at in terms of prioritising resource.
Great.
Hey, thanks, Michael. Great question, and I think there's a great maturing of our defence processes now as we think about our ever-changing strategic environment, the emerging technologies, asymmetric capabilities, how we achieve deterrence and better shape the environment, and those discussions happening at the right level and the right sort of priority around funding and sequencing. That mechanism is now very much there, and that is, I think, very welcome. And the method and the environment within which those discussions occur, I think, is very productive, and that's where it needs to stay. Of course, hasn't always been like that, and so that's why it's so important that we've got there. We've got to continue to do that as we all bring domain power to the to military power and so on to national power. And I think making those priority decisions, these decisions need to be more than just platforms. I think we tend to default to hardware. These investments need to be in people, they need to be in systems, they need to be in improving our joint culture and our ability to be masters of our profession in our own right. And those themes have come through, I think, quite strongly here. Modernisation will always be uneven, but picking points in time where you know you need to have certain capabilities and the ability to do certain things is, I think, a really important focusing function. So I don't know if I've helped there, but investing in PME, joint culture, recruiting and retention so that we can develop and retain the talent as we build it are going to be fundamental to our success into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
When I looked at the two diagrams that illustrate the air power and space power, at the centre of them was the DIME construct that we've all studied at various points in our military career. That at its heart has a whole of government effect delivery as we seek to shape, deter, respond. There are different ways that defence contributes to that whole of government objectives that we're seeking to achieve. And indeed, any operations that we've conducted, certainly in my time that I can recall, certainly been joint and invariably been whole of government. How joint and other military capabilities deliver those whole of government outcomes, it varies depending whether you're shaping, deterring, responding. The way the land, air, sea domain, cyber domain, space domain contribute to those obviously vary depending on which effect that we are delivering. I see in joint capabilities the unifying thread of where it makes sense to deliver things from an economies of scale perspective, be it the logistics system, the health system, the cyber networks that we have. That's the way to deliver the best bang for the buck to what government is trying to achieve. So when we're looking at apportioning resources to defence, taking that view of whether things are best delivered in a domain way or a joint way is one of the key considerations that as we go through investing in our capabilities we need to consider. So Michael, I think from your specific question about resources, I think defence needs to just be aware of how we deliver the effects that government require of us in terms of as a whole of government outcomes, and make judgments about how best our resources internal in defence are allocated across the domains into those capabilities.
Great. Mike, you get to give the final answer, so this is going to be definitive and good.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to pick up on a few of the points that Ian's made, and I think we've all got a sense of, yes, we understand the traditional three domains, and we now know a little bit more about space, and we're learning more about cyber. But in this space of integration of the joint force, the thing that I've probably learnt most in my time as Chief of Navy is we need to grow capacity. And particularly we need to grow capacity within the joint force as we continue to grow it. I've been campaigning now for the best part of 4 years to grow the Navy, and I've achieved a little bit of that. But in growing the Navy, where we've seen the exponential demand has actually been in the joint force. And where we have fallen short is growing that capacity. So if I think in a single domain of I need another 1,000 people in the Navy in 2040 in order to man my ships, submarines and maybe a few more helicopters, I've failed, because I need to be growing capacity to service the joint force, particularly in the space and cyber domains where Navy is well recognised as a user, but not well recognised as a contributor. And in order to get the most out of those domains, which are absolutely fundamental to the joint force, I've got to be contributing. And so I see that as a vital move forward in terms of growing capacity. I'd also like to make the comment of learning the lessons of what we have done well in each domain and applying those as we accelerate the delivery of future capabilities. As we're all seeing now, the competition that we're all facing means that we need to be able to deliver greater levels of capability quicker, and it has to be effective capability. And certainly the lessons that we've learned in Navy, particularly over the last 12 years around seaworthiness, have been largely on the piggyback of what we learned from Air Force in airworthiness. And I've been able to draw upon those lessons in real time to accelerate the delivery of seaworthy platforms, not just in making them seaworthy, but designing them to be seaworthy. And so as we look to the new domains, particularly space, I haven't got my head around space worthiness, but cyber worthiness is something that we all face every day. And it's a huge challenge. And again, we need to accelerate that delivery of worthiness in the cyber domain. And I think where the Joint Force really does come to the fore is learning those lessons over the 100+ years that we've had in the single service domains and accelerating our delivery in the joint domains that Ian has so articulately spoken about. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think a big theme about all seeing the contribution of the Joint Force as a big shift and particularly building the joint capabilities. That's a strong message. One other question that comes out of all this is there are two someones not here today. So the CDF and the Chief of Joint Operations. How does this tango between each of you and CJOPS happen when it comes to prioritising the integrated joint force? And how much does your work shape that thinking? And how much does the demand signal from CJOPS shape your choices? How does the tango work?
I'll have a start at that. I think you said CDF, I think, was the appointment. I'd actually point to the Vice Chief. So he's another very strong arm of our Joint Force requirements. He's what we call the Joint Force Authority. So he'll set the standards and the requirements that we'll have for the joint integration, if you like, C4ISR, design, these sort of things. He's the one that then really leads and is responsible to the CDF to prioritise the investments in our joint force. So all the things that we talk about here, the Vice Chief is the one that really drives that. The Chief of Joint Operations, he's the Joint Force operator. So, and he will provide the requirements back, but he's working with the force in being. So that prioritises what capabilities we will force generate, while we're then thinking about the gaps and opportunities that we have in our current force to start to look forward to the future investment. So, and then that's where the Vice Chief really comes into play as well. So that's the two distinct roles that you've got there. And of course, the Chief of Joint Operations now is increasingly operating across all 5 domains, and with all aspects of the capabilities that we can bring to bear from the 3 services, and then he also operates the space operations side of it. So the Space Commander, who newly officially launched today, she will force generate capabilities that can be force assigned to the Chief of Joint Operations to deliver those space outcomes for operational space matters. And then cyber is the only non-physical domain, is pervasive across all of that. And there's a number of areas where the Chief of Joint Operations then has to work very closely with whole of government agencies as well. So it's quite complicated. But I'd offer to the other partners on the seat.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've nailed it. I mean, really, CJOPS is employing the force in being. I mean, it is what it is. You might wish you had something else, but you can only employ what you've got. And our advice is really to prepare and maintain that readiness, understand the risk, hold the right preparedness settings, and resource it appropriately. And then ultimately, CDF will decide what's force assigned and for how long and how we manage that over time. Building the future force, though, is very much that's the process that Chief of Air Force has described, and I think quite a rigorous process now, and increasingly concept, strategy-led, very much more sophisticated force design methodology, integrated by design, and a lot of experimentation. So I think, and that process itself is now very rigorous, a lot of collaboration, and we arrive at that prioritised joint force construct, which we then, I guess, put to government for approval. But it's a pretty mature process now.
Yeah, Michael, I'll just add one other thing there too. I think not really the question you asked, but one point I'd like to make is what we're all working very hard on is with the Vice Chief to make our capability lifecycle processes more agile, accelerate the capability deliveries. These things are needed given the strategic environment. I think our colleague from Boeing, the industry representative, I guess, to talk about where industry's positioned, we need to do better at giving guidance, intent and prioritisation of where we need to go, and then finding out what's possible and then getting on with it. So the Vice Chief has a big part to play in that too.
Good. So moving to questions from the audience. This one gives the Chief of Air Force a rest because it's a question to the other three, and it is, the West has arguably enjoyed decades of assumed air dominance. How will the other domains need to adapt in a future of increased contest in air and space?
Can I just intervene for a sec, Michael?
You don't accept the premise of the question.
No, it's a really one-defence approach. I'm giving my colleagues some time to think. I'd make one statement. The term air dominance, we don't and can't do that as a small power. We might be able to get somewhere near that with the help of lots of others. Maybe a superpower could contemplate the concept of air dominance, but I think even in that case it's difficult. It's a sort of an absolute aspiration that's really difficult, and I just highlight that I think we've talked already about asymmetric approaches, about transient advantage. It's about shaping the environment to get what you need to do, where you need to do it. It's very much a Sun Tzu approach. Find the point of weakness and target that centre of gravity, and that's about how we would do it. So if you want to call it air dominance, it's only for a very defined space, in a very defined location for a defined period of time. Get in, do the job, get out. Otherwise, you're into that attrition warfare that Joe Yavasi spoke about earlier, and that's not the way we would operate.
I suppose, to be fair to the questioner, it was about the West having previously had air dominance rather than just powerful Australia. But I suppose, Rick, you touched on this a little bit with drawing more from air and space power at lower and lower echelons through the services. So that sounded to me like there's expectations for more of that to be available.
Yeah, look, I think the answer to any challenge like this is to be more unified, more integrated across not just ourselves but across allies and partners, so that we can offset any disadvantages. And the more we can do that, and the more we then apply, strategy and tactics to how we might meet those challenges, the more capabilities that we can develop to create more options, more dilemmas, to better sequence our manoeuvre options are important. And clearly, as I think about the land domain, dispersion and survivability and deception all come into play across the entirety of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's a tough world out there. I think the approach that we're taking about being more unified, about being more integrated, more sophisticated, and understanding how we can utilise each other's power to advantage through time and space and effect is what's critical.
Yep, I'd just add that interoperability, the interchangeability of our systems, particularly in the joint enabling space. We absolutely need to be connected with our coalition partners and allies to make sure we're maximising our ability to operate together.
Yeah, I think we've largely given it a pretty good shake, and I just sort of make the observation that we've been conducting joint operations in the Australian context since 1997. And as I think about my own activities, I've worked with Mel in the Joint Operations Command. I've served with Rick overseas. I've served at sea with Ian, and I think it does highlight the fact that these things, in terms of actually understanding joint, take an iteration of a generation. And if you cast your mind back prior to 1997, the service rivalries were alive and well. You don't see that now. And while we do have robust conversations around the investment committee table, they're done in a way that absolutely delivers the best outcome for the joint force. So, I think one of the challenges that we have is that we operate very successfully as a joint force, and the bar is pretty high these days. If you might have a look at the last couple of years, the three services have continued to contribute forces to CJOPS as he conducts operations around the world, and at the same time we've been supporting the effects with respect to state and federal responses to COVID. We've got over 5,000 men and women out supporting the flood response at the moment. And quite frankly, we are a small force, but a very capable joint force, and there's nothing that we don't do together. So I guess I come back to my earlier comments around capacity and Ian's comments around growing the force are not necessarily about needing to have a bigger joint force. It's being able to have the capacity to sustain the things that we currently do. And that's the pressure on all of our people in uniform at the moment, is being able to sustain the very high bar that we continue to operate at.
Well, it's obviously a more... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Mike, I just want to add two things that I think are quite tangible in terms of our joint approach. That's multi-domain strike and integrated air and missile defence, two key capabilities that we're really working on, and they are true joint capabilities that we're going to have to work on together.
Contrasting from the 90s to now, obviously, is there's a growing budget and a growing organisation, which, sure, in the world we're in, it's needed, but it does make that cooperation a bit easier, I think. Another question from the online participants is, it's good to see continuing commitment to professional mastery through domain and joint doctrine. How do we develop and retain such mastery and interoperability for combined operations? So I suppose it's that tension between the joint and the individual.
I'll have a go at that one first. As a professional logistician by trade, I've served 5 years out of Joint Operations Command, and my message to junior logisticians has always been, you must absolutely be master of your environmental domain in terms of logistics, but this applies across the board in other areas of professional skills. If you're going to come into the JOC environment, you need to be a master in the Navy's sense of that maritime logistics domain mastery. Because when you come into that joint environment and you start to develop those joint skills and understanding how the joint force comes together, the value to me as a senior officer in JOC is that you can draw upon those skills and know how to weave them in to the combined picture, into the joint operations and combined activities with our allies and partners. So we will never go away from needing to be a master of the environmental domain, particularly when you're in your junior years in the forces, but then expect to grow that into joint mastery and indeed even a combined and whole of government approach to how we deliver our effects. So it very much has a place, and then you build on that, as I see it, throughout your career.
Now, we've probably got time. I can't see any hands up in the audience, but if, in addition to ask it online, if you're having trouble with that, you can put your hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you. We've got a question here. I'm just trying to read at the bottom of it. How will the services deal with the tension between legacy human capital management and harnessing the intellect that's resident across the ADF? So I suppose this is a sort of deep inside the machine question, isn't it, about career management and broader recognition of skills that might be valuable in other parts of the joint force?
I'd sort of probably simplify that by saying we've got to be not just recognising talent across the force, but doing everything we can to retain it. We are absolutely in a battle for talent, a war for talent within the security sector, but increasingly so across the technical sector. And certainly, you know, I look at the ADF of 2022 and there's not a single element or formation in all services that don't have a very high technical content. And certainly the driving work group in my Navy is the marine technicians, and the technology that they are working with is world leading. And I simply don't have enough of them. And at the same time, we're seeing an increasing desire to do more in the technical sectors in industry in Australia, and of course the resource sector and the growing demand there speaks for itself. So I think the tension is that we know that we've got talent. In some cases we're the nursery for growing this talent. We've got to become more agile and more responsive in the mechanisms that we might need to use to retain talent and to bring it back. And I think we've done quite a lot in the joint personnel domain, I'll call it a domain, over the last 5 years in terms of our ability to use talent and transfer talent across the force. I think that's going to continue to be our biggest challenge moving forward.
Good.
Yeah, I'd add a couple of comments there. We have what we call the total workforce system too. So someone that served and gained a lot of experience, top of their field, they see a need. We make them better and stronger, as I sort of suggested earlier. Of course, that makes them attractive to the market. And we shouldn't be afraid of letting them go, because they will be contributing to another part of our national power, if you like. It might be through industry. We'd like to find a better way to keep them and attract them to, or to retain them, but we'll find another way to use them. We have to get smarter at that, and we have a total workforce system through our reserve capacity that makes use of that. I think we need to look at secondments a bit more, industry, whole of government, so it broadens that experience, exposure, strategic acumen, and a broader view of whole of government approaches. On recruitment, I think things like the cyber domain, we have to compete very strongly with some of the civilian organisations that are also dealing with cyber, and they pay a lot more than us. So we have to look at remuneration, I think, as one example, but that's not the only way. We can offer to people in the cyber domain that they can do things legally in defence that they can't do anywhere else. So, you know, I think we've got to really look at those points of leverage to make the work that they do meaningful. There's a member in the audience here, you'll probably hear from him a bit later, within the space domain. There's people not in the military that are just as passionate about national security, about our national interest as we are. We've got to really tap into that resource and bring those people online. And indeed, I think if we're going to grow by 18,500, we have to think about people that we don't just, I think, proceed with the current concept we have in a military sense of a closed workforce where you bring them in at the bottom, train them and build them up to the top. I think we're going to have to start to think about how we use recognised prior learning and other means and bring people in based on the skills they have and be prepared to move them in and out a bit more mobile. And we'll probably have to change some of the old style standards we used for recruitment as well. Some people aren't going to deploy. They may not need to be able to run the mile in 7.5 minutes or whatever it is that I have to. Well, I'm over 60 now, so I don't have to run it that quick.
So we've got time for one last question, and this, I think this is an appropriate one to end on. So it just shows the restlessness for change. Here we are, Space Command has just been formed earlier on, and we're getting a question that should Australia implement a standalone service to manage Australia's contribution to space power? And if not, how is space power developed going forward? Which is an interesting question, isn't it? To think about forming a new single domain in this emerging integrated joint system. But you've got to admire the restless aspiration in the question. So Mel, this is probably your
Yeah, sure. I think the Minister answered that this morning. He foreshadowed that he could see in the future that we might have a Space Force. I think that's the question that's being asked here. I was asked the same question by one of our journalists this morning whose historic approach is to misquote me. So I said to him not to misinterpret the words the Minister used. The Minister said, in the future. At the moment we have a Space Command. We'll work through it. We are a small force. We have to look at what's the level of efficiency and effectiveness that we can get, and whether a separate service for a Space Force is actually achievable, warranted and indeed sustainable. So there's a fair bit of work to be done yet.
I would like to back up Mel's comments by saying that when I took over as the Chief of Navy 4 years ago, people said we wouldn't have nuclear-powered submarines.
Probably.
Touché.
Well, just before we thank the four chiefs, it does make me think about that saying about parenting. You know, as a parent, you're not valuable for what you've done. You're only valuable for what you do next for your children. But anyway, with that, that's been a great panel. I think we've actually heard that there's real sincerity around this approach to a joint and integrated approach. There are tensions there, but really they're for a very common purpose. And I'd like to thank each of you for your perspectives and also for your openness in the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.